What if one of the most important clues in the Nancy Guthrie investigation was sitting right there at the front door? Not hidden in a remote desert, not buried somewhere investigators had to search for days. Right there in the house. Blood. According to reporting discussed in the supplied investigation, blood was found near the front entrance. Yet investigators initially considered the possibility that it was old blood connected to Nancy Guthrie's existing health problems. That decision became one of several early moments that would later raise serious questions about how the case was handled. Welcome back, everyone. If you enjoy following these stories with us, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the next update. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old when she disappeared from her home in Pima County, Arizona, on February 1st. She was physically frail, but people close to her described her as mentally sharp. She played mahjong, attended Bible study, read books, and was still living an active life within the limits of her health. That detail matters because, in the first hours after she vanished, there was uncertainty about what had actually happened. At first, investigators did not immediately treat the situation as the violent abduction it would later appear to be. And that is where the timeline becomes important. Nancy had been dropped off at her home that evening. She entered through the garage. Later, investigators would find that another door at the back of the house had been left propped open. There was also blood near the front door. For a family waiting desperately for answers, that should have been an unmistakable reason to stop and take a closer look. But the early response appears to have been more complicated. A Wall Street Journal journalist who examined the case later described the first 24 to 48 hours as especially important. Her reporting identified a combination of early missteps, bad luck, strained relationships between agencies, and problems that made the investigation harder. One of the most troubling details concerned the crime scene itself. The crime scene tape came down remarkably quickly. Brian Enton, who had been reporting from Arizona, said he remembered being surprised by how quickly the scene was released. In other serious cases, he had seen crime scenes remain secured for weeks while investigators continued examining them. Here, the Guthrie home was eventually returned to the family very early in the investigation. That meant the scene where Nancy was last known to be could no longer remain untouched indefinitely. And then there was that blood. The Wall Street Journal's reporting raised the possibility that investigators initially viewed it as old blood rather than evidence connected to a violent event. Nancy had health problems, including heart issues, and there was discussion about whether she could have been taking blood thinners. In an elderly person, even something that might appear minor, such as a nosebleed, can result in significant bleeding. But the amount of blood became an important question, because if that blood was connected to Nancy's disappearance, then it was potentially telling investigators something very different. It could have meant that something violent happened inside or immediately outside the house. And the longer investigators treated the situation as something less serious, the more difficult it could become to reconstruct exactly what happened. There was another problem. The people handling the investigation were working under difficult circumstances inside the homicide division. According to the reporting discussed in the interview, there had been personnel turnover in that division. The head of the homicide unit, Sergeant Stivers, had also reportedly been disciplined in November for minimizing evidence at a crime scene in previous cases. That does not establish that the same thing happened in Nancy Guthrie's case, but it became part of the larger picture examined by journalists trying to understand why the early investigation struggled. The journalist described it as a department that appeared to be in flux, and there was something else happening at the same time. The sheriff's office itself was dealing with internal tension. Sheriff Chris Nanos had narrowly won his election in November 2024, reportedly by only a few hundred votes after a recount. Then, in March, there was a vote of no confidence concerning his performance as sheriff. The conflict was not specifically a vote about the Guthrie investigation, but it added pressure inside the department while one of the most closely watched missing person cases in the country was unfolding. That is a lot for investigators to deal with. But Nancy Guthrie's disappearance was not an ordinary missing person case. As the Wall Street Journal journalist explained, Pima County handles missing person cases regularly. People become lost in the desert. Hikers become dehydrated. Older residents sometimes wander away. But Nancy's case was different. She was an older woman who disappeared from her own home, and there was blood. The question became whether investigators recognized that difference quickly enough. Then came another problem. The FBI's involvement became a subject of disagreement. President Trump publicly offered federal assistance only a few days after Nancy disappeared. Kash Patel, then FBI director, arrived in Arizona on February 9th. The FBI had also recovered video footage from a Nest camera that investigators had initially believed could not be recovered. That footage was significant. But even after the FBI became involved, questions remained about exactly when federal investigators entered the case and how much access they had during those critical first days. The local sheriff's office maintained that a deputy assigned to a federal task force had been involved early. The FBI's position was different. The distinction may sound technical, but it matters. Having one local deputy connected to a federal task force is not the same thing as having the full federal investigative operation working the crime scene. According to the reporting discussed in the interview, the FBI later returned to Nancy's home, conducted additional searches, collected more samples, and began working the case in greater force. By then, however, those crucial first days had already passed, and that brings us back to the blood at the front door. If investigators had immediately treated it as evidence of a violent crime, would anything have changed? Would the house have remained sealed longer? Would more evidence have been preserved? Would the investigation have taken a different direction? The exact answers are unknown. What is known is that the early hours of the Nancy Guthrie investigation contained several decisions that journalists later questioned, and the blood was only one of them. At first, the problems surrounding the investigation might have looked like separate incidents. The crime scene was released quickly. The blood had not immediately been treated as the decisive clue some later observers believed it could have been. The homicide division was dealing with personnel changes, and the relationship between local investigators and federal authorities appeared complicated. But when those details are placed next to one another, a much larger problem begins to emerge. The first few days of a missing person investigation can be incredibly important because evidence does not stay perfectly preserved forever. People move through a house, doors are opened, objects are touched, cameras record over old footage, memories change. And information that seems unimportant on Sunday can suddenly become critical on Monday. In Nancy's case, one of the most important questions was whether investigators understood what kind of case they were dealing with soon enough. The family had reportedly been telling authorities that Nancy was not the kind of person who would simply wander away. She was 84, physically weak, but mentally sharp. She had routines. She attended Bible study. She played mahjong. She read. Her family knew her habits. And yet, early in the investigation, there appears to have been a period when authorities were still considering explanations that did not involve a violent abduction. That matters because every hour spent pursuing the wrong possibility can affect what happens next. Then came the issue of the camera. Nancy's disappearance involved a Nest camera, and investigators initially believed footage from that camera could not be recovered because of the way the system was configured. Eventually, the FBI managed to recover footage that had previously appeared unavailable. That was an extraordinary development. But recovering the footage did not immediately solve the case. There was no person watching the video who suddenly recognized the perpetrator and gave investigators a name. There was no obvious breakthrough that brought Nancy home. Instead, investigators were left with another piece of information to analyze, and that became a pattern throughout this investigation. A clue would appear promising, but it would not necessarily lead to the answer. A person would be detained, but later questions would remain about why investigators had focused on that individual. A federal agency would become involved, but then disagreements would surface over when that involvement actually began. One example involved the first man detained in the investigation, Carlos Palos. His home in Rio Rico was searched, his phone was taken, and investigators collected his DNA. But months later, his attorney said they still did not know precisely why authorities had focused on him in the first place. The search warrant application and supporting affidavit remained sealed. That meant Carlos's legal team could not examine the information investigators had presented to a judge when they requested permission to search his property. His attorney argued that the search had been conducted without probable cause and said their goal was to get Carlos's name officially cleared. There is an important distinction here. The fact that a search warrant was issued does not by itself prove that investigators made a mistake, and the fact that Carlos's attorney believes authorities were wrong does not establish that as fact. What it does show is that a major question remained unanswered. Why him? What information caused investigators to focus on his home? Was it a tip? Was it information from surveillance technology? Was it a mistaken identification? Or was there something else that has never been made public? Those questions became even more significant because the sheriff continued to say that Carlos had not been officially cleared. That position frustrated his attorney. From the family's perspective, it also left a cloud hanging over someone who maintained he had nothing to do with Nancy's disappearance. And Carlos was not the only person caught in this uncertainty. Another man, Luke Daly, had also been detained during a later raid. Again, questions remained about what led investigators to him and what evidence, if any, supported the decision. This is where the investigation became increasingly difficult for the public to understand. The sheriff was saying one thing. The FBI was describing its involvement differently. Attorneys for detained individuals were asking for information that remained sealed, and journalists were trying to reconstruct a timeline from hundreds of separate pieces of information. The Wall Street Journal journalist who examined the case described building an enormous chronology with hundreds of data points. That approach revealed something important. There was not necessarily one single mistake that explained why Nancy had still not been found. Instead, there appeared to be a combination of missed opportunities. Some may have involved investigative decisions. Some may have been bad luck. Some involved strained relationships between agencies. And some involved information coming from the public and social media. That last part deserves attention. As Nancy's disappearance attracted national attention, people began going to the neighborhood, filming, sharing information online, and trying to help. Some of those efforts may have been well-intentioned, but a crime scene and an active investigation can become more complicated when large numbers of outsiders begin moving around and reporting what they believe they have seen. The journalist also described problems with tips coming through social media. That created another challenge for investigators. Every tip has to be evaluated. Some may contain valuable information, others may be mistaken, and some may send investigators down an entirely wrong path. There was also growing tension between the Pima County Sheriff's Office and the FBI. The disagreement centered partly on when the federal government actually became involved. The sheriff's office could point to a local deputy assigned to a federal task force and say the FBI had been informed. The FBI could point to the fact that its larger operation did not begin until several days later. Both statements could technically describe different parts of the same timeline. But for Nancy's family, the distinction probably offered little comfort. They needed investigators working together. They needed evidence preserved. And most of all, they needed Nancy found. Then, there was the issue of leadership. The sheriff had already been facing political pressure before the investigation became one of the country's most closely watched missing person cases. A vote of no confidence had taken place in March. There had also been conflict involving deputies and people inside the department. None of that proves those political problems caused specific failures in Nancy's investigation, but the reporting suggested they created an environment where the sheriff's office was already under considerable strain. And that is important, because investigations are carried out by people. They have supervisors. They have disagreements. They have competing priorities. They make decisions under pressure. Sometimes those decisions are correct. Sometimes they are not. And sometimes the consequences are not obvious until weeks or months later. For Nancy's family, time was becoming the enemy. The longer she remained missing, the more difficult it became to know which early clues had been overlooked, which information had been misunderstood, and which opportunities might already have disappeared. And one question continued to sit quietly in the background. If the blood at Nancy's front door had been treated as a major warning from the beginning, would investigators have approached everything that followed differently? There is no confirmed answer to that question. But there is another detail from the early timeline that makes it even harder to ignore. The house itself had already been returned to the family. And once that happened, investigators could no longer examine the original scene under exactly the same conditions. That brings us to perhaps the most important question of the entire early investigation. What evidence might have been preserved if authorities had recognized immediately that Nancy's disappearance was something far more serious than an ordinary missing person case? By the time investigators had a clearer picture of what might have happened to Nancy Guthrie, those critical first hours were already behind them. The blood remained one of the most troubling details. The quickly released crime scene raised questions. The recovered camera footage showed that evidence once thought unavailable could, in fact, be recovered. And the disagreement over when the FBI became fully involved added another layer of uncertainty. But the reporting does not establish that one mistake caused Nancy to remain missing. Instead, the picture that emerged was more complicated. There were early decisions that may have delayed recognizing the seriousness of the case. There was bad luck. There were problems inside the homicide division. There were tensions between agencies. And there was information coming from the public that investigators had to sort through. The Wall Street Journal's investigation described those factors as a combination rather than one single failure. And perhaps the most frustrating part is that some of the answers may never be known unless investigators eventually determine exactly what happened to Nancy. Her family has continued waiting for that answer. Savannah Guthrie, who has spoken publicly about her mother, has been careful about what she says. According to the journalist interviewed in the investigation, Savannah's public statements have been deliberate and limited, but the pain has been visible. That human side of the case is easy to lose when the story becomes a discussion about warrants, agencies, camera footage, and investigative timelines. But behind every one of those questions is an 84-year-old woman who disappeared from her own home. And that brings us back to the question that has followed this investigation from the beginning. What happened during those first hours? Was the blood simply the result of an unrelated medical issue, as investigators initially considered, or was it connected to something much more serious? The available reporting does not provide a final answer. What it does show is why the early handling of the case continues to attract attention. Investigators were working with incomplete information. They were trying to determine whether Nancy had wandered away, suffered an accident, or been taken. Then the case grew into something much larger. The FBI became involved. National attention followed. Journalists began reconstructing the timeline. Attorneys questioned why certain people had been detained. And the family continued waiting for the one piece of information that could put everything into perspective: where Nancy was and what happened to her. For now, the investigation remains unresolved. And perhaps the most important lesson from the early timeline is a simple one. Sometimes, the smallest-looking detail can become the detail everyone wishes had received more attention. In this case, one of those details was blood at the door. What do you think was the most significant early mistake in the Nancy Guthrie investigation? The handling of the crime scene, the initial interpretation of the evidence, or the confusion surrounding the agencies involved? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want to continue following this case as new information develops, make sure you subscribe.